Hi, thanks for listening to this online AOM talk. My name's Holly Engstrom, and I'm going to be talking about the vicious cycle of social status. In many countries, there's a massive gap between the wealthy and the poor. You can see that in these two starkly divided neighborhoods in South Africa. In these images of India, from India, of a public hospital in a low-income area versus a wealthy private hospital. And in these images of two schools in Australia, where the one on the left has 10 bathrooms for 500 students, the one on the right is fundraising $2.5 million for a new boathouse. This kind of economic inequality is increasing in many parts of the world, leaving those at the bottom living in harsh and stressful environments. For example, in 2019, close to 1 billion people worldwide didn't have enough food to eat, which is more than 10% of the entire world's population. And this isn't just in impoverished countries. In the US, 43.2 million people, 13% of the US population, struggle to put enough food on the table. This harsh context at the bottom of the social ladder has serious consequences. Most obviously, there are material consequences of poverty. For example, poverty limits people's access to important resources like job opportunities, safe housing, and good education. There's also important social consequences of being on the lower status end of society. For example, partially because of economic segregation in neighborhoods, people born into lower status families tend not to have many connections with wealthier people. And having that network of connections and role models is really important for getting into college or getting a good job. But what about the more invisible psychological consequences? In this talk, I'm going to outline a theoretical model that we recently published describing some important psychological consequences of low socioeconomic status. One of these psychological consequences is that living in the harsh context at the bottom of the ladder makes people think, I'm not capable of doing what it takes to get ahead. And there's many reasons why this occurs, and I definitely encourage you to check out our paper for a much more detailed explanation of them. But for example, if you're often getting discriminated against, as people in poverty frequently are, you're likely to internalize some of those stereotypes of yourself as incompetent and start to see yourself that way. Similarly, without role models to show you the steps to get to college or the social capital to get into a high-paying career, and without the resources to pay for tuition or buy the right clothing to fit in at a fancy job, you're likely to feel that those aspirations are just unrealistic or even impossible for you to reach. So in other words, the harsh context of being at the bottom of the ladder, being discriminated against, not having social capital, might cause this psychological consequence where people doubt their own capabilities. In the paper, we talk about lots of data from other labs that's consistent with this reasoning, but just to illustrate the basic association between SES and self-perceptions, here's a sample of MTurk participants who reported their SES, including objective data like their income and education, as well as their more subjective social class, or where they thought they fell on a ladder that represents the social hierarchy. And then we measure participants' belief in their own capabilities by asking how they see themselves in terms of these 4 items that reflect competence. And then we just looked at the correlation between each of these SES measures and self-perceived competence. So what I'm showing you here are the correlations between each SES measure and participants' self-reported competence. And as you can see, in each case, there's a positive correlation close to 0.2. People with high SES are likely to see themselves as more competent than people with low SES. Now, of course, I know there's probably lots of reasons for this. For example, it seems likely that people who really are less competent both end up with less education and income and also perceive themselves to be less competent, which could explain at least some of this positive relationship. But our theorizing suggests that there could also be a part of this relationship that comes from the harsh context of poverty. So internalizing the stereotypes people have about you, lacking access to social capital, actually causing you to see yourself as less competent. But let's set that debate aside for a second and at the very least just agree that people who are low down on society's ladder likely have doubts about their own abilities. And this is important. We're seeing that poverty can undermine people's belief in their own abilities. Another psychological consequence of poverty is likely that it can make people doubt that even if they were capable and put the effort in, they doubt that they will be able to get ahead. And what I mean by that is they'll doubt that the world is going to reward them fairly for whatever talents and efforts they do have. Again, we argue that this is because of the harsh context of poverty. If you're growing up in a rough neighborhood, you're going to see a lot more evidence of injustice in the world, of people being treated unfairly by others, than if you're growing up in a wealthy, gated community. As a consequence, you might then expect to be treated unfairly yourself. That is, you might doubt that others will recognize your competence and reward you accordingly with opportunities and jobs and so forth. Luckily, in that same study I just showed you, we also included a measure related to this. So how do other people see you? So in other words, if we equate how competent a high and low SES person feel they are personally, how much does each one think that others will recognize that competence and, for example, offer them a job? We find the same thing here that we did with self-perceived competence. There's a positive relationship between all three SES measures and believing that others see me as competent. And this holds controlling for self-perceived competence, which means that even if two people see themselves as equally competent, the person with lower SES is likely to believe that others won't recognize her skills and capabilities. This is important because you can imagine how difficult it would be to, let's say, perform well in a job interview if you were constantly doubting your own skills and doubting that others would see you in a positive light. So of course, again, there could be lots of reasons for this, but our theorizing suggests that this comes from seeing unfairness, seeing discrimination. So people who live in that harsh context of poverty are much more likely to see these kinds of injustices, and in turn, they're more likely to doubt that other people are going to recognize and fairly reward their skills. So again, we have some evidence supporting this link between social class and the belief that others will recognize and reward your abilities. People with lower social class were less likely to believe others would see them as competent, even if they saw themselves as competent. And the thing is, to get ahead, you need other people to recognize and reward your skills. So if you doubt that interviewers will see you as competent, or if you doubt that college application boards will recognize your skills, you're probably going to doubt that you'll be able to get ahead, even if you personally think that you do have the right skills. A third psychological consequence of poverty is that it can make people feel that getting ahead isn't actually that valuable or desirable. For example, if your friends and family all have blue-collar jobs, you might worry that they'll think that you're abandoning them or looking down on them if you get a high-power job or move out of your neighborhood. So you might start to devalue those kinds of aspirations. And if you think I'm not capable of doing what it takes to get ahead, even if I was, no one would recognize my capabilities, it might make you feel better to start to disengage from getting ahead and think, well, I don't really want to get ahead anyway. Instead, I'm going to focus my energies on my family or my hobbies. So again, that material and social context is feeding into those psychological consequences. And just so happens there's evidence for this basic relationship in the World Values Survey, which contains data from thousands of people across a ton of countries. It has two items that are relevant to the value people place on status. Specifically, it asks how much each of these items apply to you. So it's important to be rich, have a lot of money, expensive things, and it's important to be successful, have people recognize achievements. And then we just test the relationship between the SES measures included in the survey and the value people place on status. And as we predicted, all three measures of SES are positively related to how much people value status. So in other words, people with lower social class are more likely to say that it's not important to them to get rich or to have others recognize their accomplishments. And again, there could be lots of reasons underlying this pattern, but we argue that at least part of it is because of how things like worrying how your family would see ambition and disengaging from status seeking because you feel like it's too much of an uphill battle. If that's true, it would be really interesting because this would suggest a way in which the external circumstance of poverty is shaping what feels like an internal preference or a choice. So overall, living in the harsh context of poverty is at least associated with believing that you don't have a lot of skill, that you won't be rewarded fairly for whatever skill you do have, and that those rewards, jobs, money, status, aren't really all that great anyway. Another way to talk about these three beliefs is in the language of expectancy value theory. This theory would call that first belief efficacy expectations, the second belief outcome expectations, and the third belief value expectations. And according to the research behind this theory, each of these three beliefs is crucial for motivation. If you don't believe that you have what it takes, that even if you did try, you wouldn't get the outcome that you want, and you don't even really want that outcome, then you're not going to be motivated to try to get that outcome. So in other words, the harsh context of poverty might undermine people's motivation to get ahead because it undermines these three beliefs that are required for motivation. And again, we have some evidence for this from an unrelated study where we happen to measure motivation for status. We did so using two measures that are kind of different, but for the purpose of this talk, that difference is pretty irrelevant. So we can think of them both as just measuring people's tendency to find status gains or avoiding status losses motivating. So what you can see here is that across all our measures, those with higher SES were more motivated by status on both measures. So as we predicted, people with lower SES are less motivated to get more money or to avoid losing it, which is pretty surprising. But we're not the only people who find this. In a recent paper by Cameron Anderson and colleagues, they've come to similar conclusions. So in study 2 of this paper, they manipulated participant status, and they found that those who they manipulated to feel lower status felt less able to get and keep high status, which led them to be less motivated to do so. So this shows that there's this causal link between status and motivation. And in other studies in this paper, they found similar correlational patterns with participants' SES as what I showed you on the previous slide. So this evidence supports this main effect of poverty and motivation, in line with what we theorized. Now again, I know I've done a lot of talking about the harsh context of poverty, things like internalizing stereotypes, lacking social capital, witnessing injustice, fearing your family's judgment, but then all the data I've showed you just looks at correlations with SES. So to really test the idea that it's the harsh context of poverty that's responsible for these effects, we're also currently running a study where we manipulate that harsh context and then see if that actually does decrease motivation. So for example, in that study, we're manipulating whether participants face discrimination and prejudice, lack resources, lack social capital, face an unfair system, and then we're seeing if that decreases these 3 beliefs and in turn motivation the way we expect. Unfortunately, that study's on hiatus right now because of COVID, but stay tuned for that data. We're also examining how early the link between SES and motivation emerges in childhood, which will be really interesting, because of course, kids aren't really responsible for their own SES. So if we find that lower class kids are less motivated, that would tell us there's something about SES affecting motivation rather than motivation causing differences in SES. So now I want to switch gears a little bit from looking at the experience of the harsh context of poverty for those who are living in it to the perceptions of people living outside that harsh context and how they're viewing those in poverty. So what happens when people look at those in poverty and see that they appear to be demotivated? Well, these headlines illustrate that many people blame those in poverty for their fate, saying poverty is caused by people not trying hard enough. But what I've just told you about in our model is that there are external forces acting on people in poverty that make it really hard to stay motivated to get ahead. So why do people blame the individual instead of their context? Well, this link between the context of poverty and motivation is kind of hidden. To recognize that link, you'd have to see the harsh context of poverty, which middle and upper class people often don't because of economic segregation, and you'd have to recognize the complex, subtle ways that context influences people psychologically. And of course, we know from research on the fundamental attribution error, in general, people tend to attribute behavior to traits more so than to the situation. So instead, people might just look at those with lower SES and see low motivation and blame them for that low motivation because they don't see how it comes directly from the harsh context of poverty. And when people blame poor people themselves for poverty, we hypothesize that they'll be less likely to support redistribution, because why would you be interested in helping people who aren't willing to help themselves, as the party line goes? And in turn, that low support for redistribution is going to contribute to making that harsh context of poverty even harsher. So in our next studies, we set out to test this link between seeing a low SES person as demotivated and blaming them for that low motivation, and between that blame and lower support for redistribution. So in this study, participants read about someone named Tom, and they learned that he's low SES, so he grew up low income, currently lives below the poverty line. And they also learned he's not really motivated to get ahead, so he didn't try hard in high school, doesn't try to get a promotion at work, so forth. And then we asked them why they thought Tom wasn't motivated. Is it his own fault or is it from external factors? So what we found first is, as we predicted, people blame Tom's demotivation more on internal factors than external factors. So they think Tom himself is responsible for being demotivated. In the same study, we also asked participants how much they support redistribution, both specifically to Tom. So for example, I support a tax increase if it would help Tom, and in general. So for example, it's the responsibility of the government to reduce the income gap. And we found that those participants who blamed Tom for being demotivated were less likely to support redistribution, both to Tom himself and to lower class people in general. So people who thought Tom was responsible for being demotivated also were less inclined to help him. These results also hold controlling for political orientation, which is important because this pattern could emerge just because conservatives tend to blame individuals for poverty and also oppose redistribution, while liberals do the opposite. So this study supports these links that we suggested. When people see someone with low SES who appears demotivated, they blame that person themselves, and then for that reason, they're less inclined to support redistribution. In our current research, we're working on interventions to make this link between the context of poverty and decreased motivation more apparent, so that we can test whether this relationship actually is causal, but also so that we can potentially increase support for redistribution. And so far we have some promising results, but we're still working on the replication studies, so stay tuned for that data. In sum, our model suggests that the harsh context of poverty inhibits these three beliefs that are crucial for motivation, but that people don't see the connection between the context of poverty and motivation, leading them to blame poor people themselves for being demotivated and oppose redistribution, which ends up making this harsh context of poverty even harsher. And today I presented some preliminary data to you supporting some of these links in the model, though of course there's still plenty of work left to be done. I want to be clear that we're not suggesting that all lower class people are demotivated or lazy. Of course, there's tons of examples of really hardworking people who grew up in lower income families and made it to the top. So Oprah Winfrey, Stephen King, tons of other anecdotes. And even beyond those anecdotes, in our data, most of the correlations between social class and motivation I showed you were pretty small. So there's no one-to-one relationship between social class and motivation. But instead, the point I'm trying to make here is that those stories of success and resilience are even more impressive than we might realize, as the deck is stacked against people in poverty, both in that it's actually materially just really hard to get ahead, lacking resources, being discriminated against, and so on, but also in that those problems actually affect your psychology and motivation, often in invisible ways. So thank you all for listening. Thanks to my advisor and co-author, Kristen Lauren, all my amazing research assistants, and great feedback from my lab on this talk. Bye.